I never intended to become that neighbor. You know the one. The guy who turns his lawn into a battleground, who glares at the HOA president during meetings, who silently plots retribution over the course of coffee-fueled evenings. But that's exactly who I became. And it all started with a letter. A single, smugly worded letter that changed everything. The envelope came on a Tuesday. White, generic, with the HOA's stamp and my address printed like a government summons. The kind of envelope you know not to open until you've brewed a strong cup of coffee and braced for nonsense. Inside was a 2-paragraph notice filled with what I can only describe as weaponized politeness. I was being fined $500 for unauthorized horticultural alterations. That's HOA speak for planting tulips. Yes, tulips. I had spent a sunny Saturday, one of those rare spring days that actually feels like a gift, planting 3 rows of red, orange, and yellow tulip bulbs along the walkway to my porch. No plastic flamingos. No artificial turf. Just flowers. The kind people photograph at botanical gardens and post with hashtags like #springvibes. Apparently, though, in the pristine dictatorship that was the Cedar Hills Homeowners Association, tulips were a violation of Section 3.2 of the Landscaping Uniformity Agreement. Who knew? The letter included a grainy photo, clearly taken by someone crouching behind a bush across the street, showing my freshly planted tulips and a timestamp. The final line read, "As this is your first violation this year, a fine of $500 will be levied, payable within 30 days. No warning, no request for removal, just a fine, $500. I stared at the letter for a long time, partly out of disbelief, partly because my pulse was too loud in my ears to hear anything else. I'd heard stories about overzealous HOA boards, about neighbors being fined for having the wrong shade of mulch or leaving their recycling bin out for too long. But I never thought it would come for me. I had followed every rule, kept my lawn trimmed, pressure washed the driveway, even repainted my shutters last fall to a shade called desert slate that matched the neighborhood palette requirements. I wasn't rebellious. I just wanted a home that looked cared for. But apparently, my care didn't come with enough committee oversight. I looked around my yard. The tulips were already starting to bloom. Small, vibrant heads poking through the soil, unaware they were the source of controversy. I thought about removing them, about avoiding the drama. But something in me hardened. It wasn't the money. It was the message. That they could dictate beauty. That they could penalize joy. That night, as I sat in the living room sipping a beer and staring out at the cursed flower beds, something shifted. I opened my laptop and typed 4 words into the search bar. Halloween yard decorations ideas. It wasn't even October. But suddenly, I knew exactly how I'd pay my fine, how I'd invest it. Really. If I was going to be punished for my garden, then maybe it was time to plant something darker. And with that, the seeds of revenge were sown. The next morning, I woke up with clarity. The kind of clarity that usually comes after months of overthinking. But this time, it arrived overnight like a lightning strike. If the HOA wanted to fine me for planting flowers that brought joy, I would give them something worth writing about. Something far worse in their eyes. Something spectacularly unauthorized. I wasn't going to plant flowers anymore. I was going to build a cemetery. Not just any cemetery, though. This would be a handcrafted, legally untouchable, seasonally appropriate Halloween display. The kind that people drive by slowly with their phones out. The kind that winds up on the local news. And most importantly, the kind that was, by HOA standards, entirely within my rights. It wasn't even close to Halloween yet. Early May, maybe. But the bylaws had no calendar restriction on themed decorative installations. There was a vague mention about seasonal displays not exceeding 45 days. But nothing about how early they could start. Besides, no one had ever enforced that clause. Until now, I had never seen a single letter about a seasonal display. I figured if they could get creative with rules, so could I. So I spent that weekend at every hardware store and craft supply outlet within a 20-mile radius. My shopping list was strange enough to raise eyebrows. PVC pipes, foam boards, black spray paint, plastic skeleton arms, wire hangers, red LED lights, bags of sand, even an old fog machine I found on clearance. Every item I bought felt like adding another chapter to a story I hadn't finished writing yet. Then came the centerpiece of my masterpiece, gravestones. Homemade, lightweight, waterproof gravestones cut from foam insulation board. Each one shaped, weathered, and painted by hand to look chipped and aged. I leaned into every horror movie cliché I could remember. Cracked crosses, crooked slabs, twisted angels. But here's where it got petty, and this was important. Each tombstone bore a name, a familiar name. I started with Martha G., the HOA board treasurer who once left a passive-aggressive note on my trash bin for being 3 inches off the curb. Then Stephen L., the guy who complained about kids' bikes being left on sidewalks. Then Carl R., the secretary who'd spearheaded the flower crackdown. I even made his headstone lean slightly forward, like it was staring at the street in eternal disapproval. Of course, I didn't use their full names, just initials. Just enough to make the point without opening myself to actual legal consequences. And just enough for them to know it was about them. I worked on the graveyard every day after work, starting with the border, black plastic fencing and jagged stones that gave the entire front lawn a gloomy edge. Then came the fog machine, which I rigged to activate when someone walked near the walkway, using a cheap motion sensor from a Halloween store. I positioned skeleton arms to reach up from the soil in front of each gravestone, and placed little signs with phrases like R.I.P. Neighborhood Joy and Here Lies Common Sense. By the end of week 2, my garden was fully transformed. The tulips were still blooming, but now they were surrounded by gravestones and eerie lighting. The juxtaposition was poetic, color and life growing out of symbolic death. I didn't remove the flowers out of spite. Instead, I let them stay, almost defiantly cheerful against the doom and gloom. Neighbors started slowing down as they drove past. Some laughed. Others just stared. A few took pictures. One evening, a family I didn't recognize strolled by and gave me a thumbs up. But I wasn't doing it for applause. I was doing it for the board. The first real reaction came on a Friday afternoon when I spotted Carl R., standing across the street, hands on his hips, eyes locked onto the tombstone bearing his initials. He didn't come over. He didn't say anything, just stood there for a full 2 minutes, then walked away. That night, I added a plastic crow to the top of his gravestone. I wasn't done. This was only phase 1. It didn't take long for the HOA to react. By the 3rd week, word had spread. My house, or more specifically, my front yard, had become the unexpected spectacle of the neighborhood. The cheerful, flower-lined walkway that once blended in with rows of manicured lawns now stood in loud, unignorable contrast. Where others had neat shrubs and trimmed hedges, I had fog machines, faux crows, skeletal arms clawing at the sky, and tombstones for the very people who made the rules. And while most of the neighbors took it as harmless entertainment, even cathartic for those who had long nursed their own grievances against the HOA, the board didn't see it that way. Not at all. It was a Tuesday morning when I got the knock. Not a casual tap or a friendly neighborly greeting. It was sharp, purposeful, the kind of knock you hear when someone shows up with a clipboard and bad intentions. I opened the door to find Linda Morrison, the HOA president herself, flanked by Carl R., and a 3rd member I hadn't met before. All 3 wore the unmistakable uniform of self-importance. Business casual in the middle of a weekday, name tags clipped to lanyards, and expressions that made it clear this wasn't a social call. They didn't ask to come in. They didn't make small talk. They handed me a letter sealed, of course, and said it was an official notice of violation. Then, with a synchronized turn, they walked back down my driveway without another word. I waited until they were gone before I opened it. The letter was predictable. A list of alleged infractions. Non-seasonal decorative displays. Installation of offensive imagery. Targeted character references toward board members. Failure to maintain HOA landscaping standards. And finally, the kicker, an additional $250 fine to be added to the original $500. I laughed. Not because it was funny, it wasn't, but because of the sheer audacity. The irony of it. They couldn't find me for tulips, so now they were trying to find me for themed decorations that technically fell within the vague parameters of their own rulebook. That night, I reread the HOA bylaws again, more carefully this time. I studied each section that had anything to do with holiday decor, landscaping, or public display. The language was intentionally murky, open-ended phrases like tasteful, appropriate, and community harmony repeated like mantras. But nowhere, and I mean nowhere, did it say I couldn't display mock gravestones, fake cobwebs, or Halloween themes. There was one clause about displays that caused distress to other residents, but it required a minimum of 5 formal complaints from unique households before any action could be taken. I doubted they had even one, so I kept going. I added solar-powered lights behind each gravestone, casting eerie shadows on the sidewalk after sunset. I built a small mausoleum out of plywood, painted gray, with rubber bats hanging from the inside. I started playing ambient soundtracks at low volume in the evening. Distant thunder, creaking wood, the occasional crow caw. Every addition was strategically placed, thoughtfully legal, and thoroughly theatrical. But more importantly, it was documentation proof. I took photos of every angle. I printed receipts. I noted every addition and every date. I was playing their game now, only I was playing it better. A week after their first notice, the board returned, this time, during one of their scheduled compliance walkthroughs. I watched from the living room window as they paused in front of my yard, clipboards in hand, whispering back and forth like school teachers debating detention. Linda didn't look happy. Carl looked mortified. And the third board member, a younger guy named Josh, I later learned, actually cracked a smile before quickly suppressing it. They stood there for a full 5 minutes. Then they walked on. No new letter came that week. But the tension was building. My graveyard garden had become more than just a petty protest. It had become a symbol. People stopped by to compliment it. One neighbor even dropped off a plastic skull she found at a garage sale and said, "Add this wherever it hurts most." Another left a note in my mailbox. "Best yard on the block. Keep going." So I did. Because if the board thought they could bury me in paperwork, they were about to see what it felt like to be buried in something much darker. As the sun began to set earlier and the crisp edge of fall settled in, my yard evolved from a silent protest into a full-blown neighborhood attraction. Every day someone would pass by, walkers, dog owners, even high schoolers riding bikes, and pause. Some smiled. Some took photos. Others gave me a thumbs up or a knowing nod. But most importantly, no one complained. What had started as a garden violation had morphed into something much larger. A subtle act of rebellion that had struck a nerve with people far beyond my little corner of the street. The gravestones became the centerpiece, each one meticulously crafted, weatherproofed with a gray cement-like finish, and etched with faux epitaphs referencing the absurdity of HOA rules. One said, "Here lies Carl's sense of humor." Another read, "R.I.P. Common sense, last seen at the monthly board meeting." A third, placed directly under a motion sensor light, simply said, "Linda's Law, where fun comes to die." They weren't vulgar. They weren't threatening. But they were sharp, and everyone knew exactly who they were aimed at. I hadn't touched the original flowers they'd find me for. I let them flourish, tall and defiant, weaving through the gravestones like nature reclaiming a battlefield. The once punished peonies and daisies now stood as symbols, colorful, living reminders that this fight had started over something as innocent as a flowerbed. Then, a curious shift began to happen. People started contributing. One morning, I woke up to find a plastic skeleton propped on a miniature bench, holding a small sign that said, "Still waiting on permit approval." Another day, someone planted a small garden gnome dressed in a judge's robe beside one of the gravestones. Little gifts, decorations, anonymous messages began appearing like breadcrumbs. Signs that I wasn't alone in my frustration. That others, too, had long simmered under the suffocating pressure of the HOA's arbitrary control. It wasn't just symbolism anymore. It was solidarity. Then came the notes, short messages left under my doormat in my mailbox, slipped into the screen door. Notes from neighbors I barely knew, sharing their own HOA horror stories. One woman told me she'd been fined for hanging wind chimes because the sound disturbed the uniform tranquility. Another man was written up for painting his garage door one shade darker than the neighborhood palette, even though he'd matched it to the sample provided. They were stories of absurdity, but they were also stories of fear. Fear of retaliation, of escalating fines, of legal threats. The HOA, in many ways, had become less a governing body and more a neighborhood surveillance state. But my yard had cracked that silence. It gave people permission to laugh again, to challenge the HOA's reign not with lawsuits, but with levity. And that, I realized, was more powerful than rage. Still, I knew the board wouldn't sit quietly. Power like that, especially the self-appointed kind, doesn't tolerate mockery for long. The next HOA meeting, scheduled for the second week of October, loomed on the calendar like a storm cloud, and I had no doubt my yard would be the opening topic. But I didn't care, because by then I had made a decision. I wasn't going to take anything down. I wasn't going to retreat. In fact, I was preparing to expand, using my own money, which, ironically, was the same amount they fined me. I ordered a professional fog machine, more lighting equipment, and a larger-than-life animatronic reaper that would guard the yard from dusk until dawn. I even mapped out a mini path so families could walk through the display safely without trampling the flowers. And as I planned, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A subtle shift in the way people looked at my house. It wasn't just curiosity. It wasn't even just admiration. It was relief. The kind you see when someone else finally says the thing everyone else has been too afraid to speak aloud. That week, I got an invitation to a block party from a neighbor 3 streets over. It was the first one I'd received since moving in. And when I showed up, people recognized me not by name but by address. "You're the graveyard guy, right?" someone asked with a grin. I was just getting started. It didn't take long, roughly 48 hours after the block party, where word of my unauthorized Halloween-themed front yard had spread like wildfire. I received a cream-colored envelope stamped with the dreaded HOA seal. It was tucked under my door, not mailed, as if to remind me this was personal. I already knew what it was before opening it. The letter, written in dense legalese, was a formal notice of non-compliance, with references to Section 8.3.2 of the Community Guidelines regarding exterior seasonal displays and property uniformity. The offense? Obstruction of visual cohesion and potential neighborhood disruption. In simpler terms, they didn't like my decorations. But this wasn't just a warning. Attached to the letter was a notice of escalated fine, an additional $750 if the graveyard display wasn't removed within 5 business days. The total penalties now stood at $1,250, all because I had the gall to plant flowers and get creative with plastic tombstones. I sat down, reread it, and didn't feel fear. I felt resolve. This was no longer about a flower bed. This was about power, control, and bullying cloaked in bureaucracy. I wasn't breaking any laws. I'd reviewed the bylaws. There was no specified restriction on seasonal displays beyond obscene or disturbing content. And unless someone thought fake skeletons and fog machines were equivalent to horror propaganda, they didn't have a leg to stand on. Still, I wasn't going to fight them with emotion. I was going to fight them with precision. I printed every version of the HOA bylaws I could find, including archived versions. I read them line by line. I highlighted contradictions. I pulled county ordinances on holiday decorations and compared language. I even researched state-level laws about HOA limits. By the end of the weekend, I had a folder thicker than the HOA handbook itself. Proof that what I'd done was not just legal, but well within my rights. To reinforce my stance, I reached out to a local civil rights attorney who specialized in property law. I expected a hefty fee or perhaps a vague consultation. Instead, I was met with enthusiasm. Apparently, my HOA had a bit of a reputation, and I wasn't the first person to butt heads with them. The lawyer agreed to draft a formal response on my behalf. A concise, polite, but ironclad letter that dismantled their claims piece by piece. Cited case law, quoted their own rules. It even referenced my First Amendment right to expression through seasonal decor. The next day, I hand-delivered that letter back to the HOA president's mailbox. But I didn't stop there. While waiting for their next move, I doubled down on the yard. The animatronic reaper arrived and stood nearly 7 feet tall at the edge of the flower bed. Its eyes glowed red, and its scythe moved slowly with the wind. I wired the fog machine to a timer and synced it with dusk. I planted 2 motion-triggered sound sensors that let out soft, eerie moans when someone passed the walkway. Nothing loud or intrusive, just enough to make the yard feel alive. Then, as a final touch, I added 3 new gravestones. These weren't named after specific individuals but bore phrases that needed no decoding. Here lies reason killed by red tape. Beloved. Free will gone, but not forgotten. Rest easy, peace and quiet, until the next violation notice. By that evening, cars began slowing as they passed my house. A few even parked across the street. Kids pointed from their windows. More neighbors stopped to chat. Not out of curiosity but support. And then came the text messages. Apparently, after receiving my lawyer's response, the HOA board was rattled. Rumors swirled that some members wanted to rescind the fine quietly, while others, namely the president, doubled down and insisted we take it to arbitration. They weren't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who did their homework. In a strange twist, one of the newer board members, an older gentleman named Harris, stopped by in person. He didn't say much, just looked around, nodded at the decorations and said, "It's clever, and, honestly, it's about time someone stood up." He left without another word. That night, as fog drifted through the yard and the soft glow of lanterns flickered among the gravestones, I felt something shift in the air. Not fear, not tension, but momentum. What began as a solitary protest was becoming something bigger, a statement. Not just against bad rules, but against the way they were enforced. I wasn't alone anymore, and I had no intention of backing down. Because the thing about bullies is, once you stop letting them push you, they panic. And panic is exactly what I planned to make them feel next. By the time October rolled into its second week, my front yard had become something of a suburban spectacle. What had started as a petty act of rebellion, skeletons, fog machines, and gravestones, now drew nightly visitors. Families would stroll by, kids would giggle at the tombstones, and teens dared each other to walk past the looming reaper after dark. It was fun, harmless, and entirely seasonal. But not everyone was thrilled. The HOA board wasn't just seething, they were scrambling. Behind closed doors, they'd begun working on a decor policy update, which was exactly what it sounded like. A rushed amendment designed specifically to give them the power to shut down my display before Halloween night. But since it wasn't in the original bylaws, they couldn't just enforce it immediately. They needed a community vote. That meant an emergency HOA meeting. And I knew they would try everything to tip the vote in their favor. Flyers were distributed, more like warnings than invitations. Phrases like urgent community decision and prevent future disruptions were plastered across the announcements. But the language was vague. Nowhere did it specifically say the meeting was about me or my decorations. They were trying to disguise their intentions. Still, word spread fast. My supporters, which now included more than half the block, made sure everyone knew what was at stake. It wasn't about one man's Halloween decorations anymore. It was about precedent. If the board succeeded in rewriting rules to punish personal expression, what would they go after next? The meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday night at the community clubhouse, the same space where they usually hosted lukewarm coffee socials and rule-heavy gatherings about hedges and paint swatches. But that night, the building was packed. More people showed up than anyone anticipated. Chairs were brought in from other rooms. People stood along the walls. Even residents who rarely attended anything HOA-related made time to be there. Some were visibly angry, others simply curious. But the tension? It was thick. The board sat at a long folding table at the front of the room. 6 members in pressed blazers and tight smiles. The president, a woman named Cynthia, sat dead center, her hands folded like a poker player with a losing hand. She began the meeting with a calm voice, thanking everyone for coming and framing the vote as a necessary measure to preserve the community aesthetic and seasonal order. Her words were rehearsed, her tone sterile, Then came the unveiling of the proposed amendment, a document that stated residents could only use seasonal displays of modest scale, with specific limits on height, volume, duration, and content. Most importantly, it gave the board unilateral authority to decide what constituted disturbing or non-harmonious decorations. Essentially, they wanted to create a rule where taste was law, their taste. As expected, Cynthia tried to fast-track the vote without discussion. But that's when things got interesting. Hands shot up. Residents stood one by one, voicing their frustration. A young couple said their Halloween decorations had been up for years without complaint. A retired schoolteacher asked why the board never brought up such rules before this year. One neighbor bluntly asked if this was just a way to target one man for not planting roses. I remained seated at first, letting the community speak. Their support was louder than any argument I could have prepared. But when the board tried to redirect the conversation, claiming this was not about individuals, I finally stood. I walked to the front, calmly, with a folder in hand. In it were pictures of homes in the neighborhood from the past 5 years, all showcasing seasonal decorations. Some had flashing lights. Some had inflatable witches. One, from last year, had a 12-foot werewolf that howled on a timer. None had ever been fined. Then I presented my own display. Quieter, less intrusive, and set to turn off at 10 p.m. every night. I reminded them that the only thing different this year was that my decorations came after an earlier dispute. One that started because of flowers. The room murmured. The hypocrisy was obvious. And then I dropped the real bombshell. A letter from my attorney stating that if the amendment passed and was applied retroactively, legal action would follow, citing freedom of expression, selective enforcement, and harassment through retroactive rule changes. The mood shifted. People who were unsure before now saw the vote for what it was: retaliation. When the vote was finally called, ballots were passed around. One by one, neighbors checked their boxes. 15 minutes later, the results were read aloud. The amendment failed. By a wide margin. Applause erupted. Not just from my side of the room, but from those who simply wanted fairness. The board looked stunned. Cynthia gave a tight smile, thanked everyone again, and quickly adjourned the meeting. As people filed out, several neighbors patted me on the back, thanked me for standing up, and promised to drop by Halloween night with their kids. It wasn't just a win for me. It was a win for the whole street. And Halloween was still 2 weeks away. The community meeting was supposed to be the end of it. The amendment had failed. The vote was decisive. The people had spoken. Halloween decorations, including my now locally famous graveyard setup, would remain untouched. The neighborhood felt lighter in the days that followed, as if a collective breath had been held and finally released. People smiled more. Kids rode their bikes past my yard and gave me a thumbs up. The tension that had hung like fog over our cul-de-sac started to lift. But that's when the HOA decided to escalate. Not publicly. Not through official memos or meetings. This was something quieter, more insidious. Something meant to rattle me without drawing too much attention. It started with an envelope on my doorstep. Unlike the previous letters with printed HOA logos and typed fines, this one was hand-delivered and stuffed inside a plain white envelope. Inside was a legal notice, a cease and desist order. The claim that my decorations posed a public nuisance and emotional distress to specific residents. And if not removed within 72 hours, I would be subject to a civil lawsuit for damages. There were no signatures from the board. Just one name on the complaint: Cynthia, the HOA president. She had filed it personally. This wasn't about bylaws anymore. This was personal vendetta masquerading as legal recourse. And it changed everything. I wasn't naive. I knew that technically, anyone could file a civil suit over almost anything. But nuisance claims required a high burden of proof, something the HOA had little of. No complaints had been filed with the city. No noise violations. No evidence of trespass or safety hazards. Still, the document was a warning shot. Cynthia had lost the vote, but she was still determined to silence me, one way or another. That same day, I contacted my attorney again. He reviewed the complaint and confirmed what I suspected: it was weak. laughably so. But that didn't mean it couldn't create chaos. Legal battles, no matter how baseless, cost time and money. So I made a decision. I wasn't going to be baited into tearing down my decorations. Not now. Not with the neighborhood on my side and Halloween just a week away. But I also wasn't going to take this lying down. Instead, I leaned in, not with pettiness but with precision. First, I doubled down on documenting everything. Every night, I filmed my front yard with a time-stamped camera, showing the lights shutting off at exactly 10 p.m. I recorded the decibel levels with a smartphone app, proving my ambient sound was no louder than passing traffic. I saved every message of support from neighbors, and even asked a few to write short statements confirming that my display wasn't causing any disruption. Second, I submitted a public records request to the HOA board. Since Cynthia was attempting to blur the lines between her personal grievance and her official capacity as HOA president, I wanted a paper trail. Meeting minutes, email exchanges, any correspondence about me, my decorations, or the failed amendment. If they were weaponizing the HOA to settle a personal grudge, I intended to prove it. Third, and perhaps most cathartically, I updated the display. Subtly, tastefully, but symbolically. A new gravestone appeared in the center of the yard. It was taller than the rest. Painted in matte gray, a skeletal hand reached from the dirt, clutching a piece of paper that read, in bright red paint, "You've been served." The neighborhood got the joke immediately. Kids laughed. Adults smirked knowingly. Some even took selfies beside it. But the message was clear. I wasn't backing down. As Halloween crept closer, the HOA board stayed mostly silent. There were no new memos, no further attempts to enforce the failed amendment. But Cynthia, she wasn't done. 2 days before Halloween, I received notice of a court date. Small claims court, the fastest track available. She was really going through with it. But what she didn't know was that I was more prepared than she ever expected. I had a legal packet the size of a phone book, video documentation, witness statements, photos from previous years showing similarly extravagant displays in the neighborhood, none of which had ever been challenged. I even had copies of the HOA's own seasonal newsletters praising holiday spirit and encouraging festive participation. Cynthia's case wasn't just petty, it was hypocritical. Halloween morning arrived cold and clear. The yard was ready. Fog machines timed. Candles lit. Candy bowls prepped. The final touches added just before sunset. This year, more than ever, the decorations meant something. And even as Cynthia's lawsuit loomed like a dark cloud overhead, I felt something different. Calm. I wasn't just defending a garden anymore. I was defending the right to exist freely in my own space, the right to creativity, to humor, to joy, without being crushed under the weight of someone else's control. The sun dipped behind the horizon. The fog rolled in. The first group of trick-or-treaters giggled their way up the sidewalk, and the graveyard came to life. Halloween passed like a dream, or perhaps more accurately, like a triumphant parade that wound its way across my lawn and through the hearts of an entire neighborhood. That night, my front yard graveyard became the epicenter of Oak Point's festivities. Families flooded in from not just our street, but surrounding blocks. Kids, wide-eyed and costumed, danced through the fog and lights. Adults lingered by the edge of the lawn, chatting with me about the ridiculousness of the fine, complimenting the detail of the tombstones, and whispering gossip about Cynthia's meltdown at the board meeting. Some even said she had stood at the end of her driveway, arms folded, seething as car after car passed by to witness the spectacle she had tried to shut down. By 10 p.m., when the lights dimmed and the last few costumed wanderers trickled off into the night, I stood at the edge of the yard, bone-tired and satisfied. But the true finale came 3 days later. The courthouse was nothing grand. Just a municipal building with stale carpets and fluorescent lights, tucked between a tax office and a county clerk's department. Small claims court, quick, procedural, and often overlooked, felt like an odd place for the climax of such a ridiculous neighborhood war. But here we were. I wore a suit. Nothing flashy, just neat, respectful. My documents were in order, sorted, tabbed, and ready for presentation. My attorney, a calm, silver-haired man named Marcus, stood beside me like a stoic sentry. He didn't say much, he didn't have to. The facts were on our side. Across the aisle sat Cynthia. She had dressed for battle. Her royal blue blazer was ironed to perfection. Her pearl earrings glinted in the sterile courtroom light. And beside her was a stack of paperwork. Less than mine, but no doubt selected for drama rather than accuracy. When the judge entered, everything fell silent. He was middle-aged, tired-looking, and likely used to dealing with parking disputes and contractor complaints. I wondered how many times he'd been asked to rule on Halloween lawn decorations. Cynthia was called to speak first. Her voice was rehearsed, calculated. She spoke of mental distress, of visual aggression, of how the decorations threatened the peace and cohesion of the neighborhood. She claimed the gravestones were targeted harassment, citing her name printed on one of them. She even tried to introduce blurry photos of kids looking frightened. Photos we later proved were taken years prior at entirely different events. The judge listened, jotting a few notes. Then it was my turn. I didn't get theatrical. I didn't need to. We presented video footage from each night showing no noise violations and no activity past 10 p.m. Decibel readings proving ambient sounds stayed within legal limits. HOA bylaws that made zero mention of temporary Halloween displays. Signed testimonials from 11 neighbors attesting to the display being family-friendly and non-disruptive. Past newsletters and HOA photo contests where Cynthia herself had praised other extreme holiday setups. And then we dropped the final piece. A printed email thread, acquired via public records request, in which Cynthia privately encouraged another board member to make an example of me to discourage the growing culture of defiance. The judge raised his eyebrows at that one. He didn't deliberate long. The ruling was swift. Cynthia's claim was dismissed in full. No damages awarded. No further restrictions placed. The judge even cautioned her about the dangers of using civil court for personal vendettas, a rare public scolding in the normally restrained courtroom. As I stood to leave, I glanced at Cynthia. She didn't meet my eyes. Her posture sagged. The color had drained from her face. She looked like a person who had just realized the community she ruled over had moved on without her, and maybe even against her. Outside the courthouse, a few neighbors had gathered in quiet support. One brought coffee. Another, a local teacher, offered to host next year's Halloween decorating contest and asked if I'd consider judging it. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who was nearly fined out of his garden was now being asked to set the tone for the entire neighborhood's festivities. That evening, I returned home to find a small note in my mailbox. No envelope, just a scrap of paper folded twice. It read, "I may not agree with your methods, but you made your point. Congratulations." A neighbor. No signature. But I recognized the handwriting. It was Cynthia's. The dust had settled. The court ruling was final. The note in my mailbox, cryptic and unsigned, but unmistakably Cynthia's, was the last whimper from a conflict that had once threatened to uproot everything I'd built. And so, with autumn leaves thinning and winter creeping in, the skeletons and tombstones came down. One by one, I disassembled the Halloween graveyard. Not in bitterness, but in quiet satisfaction. The fog machines were packed away, the LED uplights stored neatly in the shed, and the foam tombstones, including the one bearing Cynthia's name, were carefully laid into storage bins labeled for next year. I didn't throw any of it away. I had a feeling it would see daylight again. But now it was time to rebuild. Not as retaliation, not as a message, but as something purer. The garden was coming back. The ground was hard from weeks of foot traffic. The grass was patchy. The soil was compressed from where dozens of tiny feet had trampled across it during the festivities. But underneath it all, I saw potential. Not just for plants or landscaping, but for something symbolic. A space reclaimed. Not from HOA rules, but from fear. For years, I had let petty regulations and neighborly pressure dictate what I could grow, how I could decorate, and even how much joy my yard could reflect. That was over. So I started sketching a new layout. This time, I wouldn't tiptoe around HOA expectations. I would work with the rules, or rather, through the gaps in them. I knew the bylaws better than most board members at this point, and I used that knowledge like a blueprint. Out came the old flower beds. In went tiered planter boxes, not technically permanent structures, which meant no approval was needed. I chose native perennials that required less watering and were harder to regulate due to their classification as sustainable landscaping. I installed solar-powered lighting, nestled discreetly along the edges of the path. Not too bright, not too decorative, just functional enough to slide past aesthetic restrictions. In the center, where the faux crypt had once stood, I placed a large ceramic pot bursting with ornamental kale, pansies, and dusty miller, cool weather champions that painted the space in silvery greens, purples, and vibrant yellow. Their arrangement echoed the chaos of Halloween, just refined, quiet, and undeniably beautiful. Neighbors began to take notice. One by one, people paused during morning dog walks or evening strolls to admire the transformation. The same parents who had brought their kids through the fog and laughter were now complimenting the garden's new life. The retired couple across the street even asked for help starting their own native flower plot. But the biggest surprise came 2 weeks later, when a folded piece of paper arrived in my mailbox again. This one was official. An announcement from the HOA. The board was proposing a resident garden recognition program, an optional, seasonal award for homeowners who demonstrated creativity, sustainability, and community spirit through their landscaping. I read it twice. The wording felt familiar. Too familiar. The criteria listed native plant use, community engagement, and temporary decorative themes as factors. It was, in essence, a polite backpedal, a peace offering in the form of a garden contest, a way to quietly acknowledge what had happened without admitting fault. I didn't scoff at it. I smiled. In its own way, the HOA was learning, adapting to a community that had grown tired of rigidity and fear. And me, I accepted their invitation, not to compete, but to host. At the next board meeting, which I attended not out of spite but curiosity, I raised my hand and offered to run the new recognition program as a volunteer. Cynthia was still on the board, though noticeably quieter, her hair pinned with a little less force. She didn't object. In fact, she nodded. And that's how I found myself, months after a $500 fine nearly broke me, creating a neighborhood gardening club. What started with a graveyard ended in community composting workshops, seed exchanges, and sidewalk flower tours. The same HOA lawn that once hosted Ghost Props now served as the staging ground for a spring kickoff gardening fair, complete with local vendors, soil experts, and a table where kids could paint flower pots. Change didn't arrive in a single act. It grew, quietly, patiently, just like a garden should. Winter passed quietly. The bare branches softened under frost, and the once fiery autumn leaves faded into quiet mulch beneath the dormant soil. But beneath it all, under the silence, under the cold, something was waiting to rise. The garden, of course, but also the neighborhood itself. Because the story, which had started with a $500 fine for planting unauthorized flowers, had done something far more powerful than just reshape my front yard. It had shaken something loose in the very foundation of Oak Hill Ridge. I could feel it in the way people walked their dogs now, slower, with more purpose, more comfort. I saw it in the growing number of flower boxes, trellises, and herb gardens cropping up across driveways and side yards. What used to be rows of monotonous mulch beds and HOA-approved shrubbery had begun to evolve into something more alive. And it wasn't just plants. The community started showing signs of rebirth too. The gardening club, once an experiment, had grown from 5 to 23 members, and it wasn't just retirees with time to spare. Young couples, busy parents, even teenagers joined in. We held monthly potlucks, always outdoors, always among the plants. We shared not only composting tips and pruning advice, but stories of ridiculous HOA warnings, silent protests, and small, hard-earned victories. We didn't organize these gatherings as rebellions. Not anymore. They were something softer, something more lasting. One weekend in early spring, a neighbor named Luis, who I had only spoken to once before the Halloween event, unveiled a vertical hydroponic garden in his side yard. The next day, Judy from 3 streets over planted a circle of tulips around her mailbox. Using repurposed bricks and solar-powered lights, Someone else painted their birdhouse. Another left a ceramic frog by their walkway. These were small things, but in a neighborhood where conformity once reigned, they were everything. Even the HOA began to shift, slowly, stiffly, like a ship changing course after years of drifting on autopilot. New board members were voted in that spring, and Cynthia, the former enforcer of uniform aesthetics, resigned from her post with little fanfare. No scandal, no spectacle, just a quiet departure. The final trace of her presence in the HOA minutes was a single sentence thanking her for her years of service. I didn't celebrate her resignation. I didn't need to. What mattered was what came after her. A new willingness to listen, to balance order with humanity. At the summer community meeting, I was invited to present the first ever Oak Hill Garden Spirit Awards. It was a silly little ceremony, but it meant everything to me. We gave out wooden plaques shaped like flowers. Kids drew signs in crayon. The event ended with a group planting of a dogwood tree at the edge of the HOA park. That tree stands now as a symbol of what changed. Not just a tree, not just a garden. A reminder that sometimes transformation comes from the most unexpected acts. Mine had been a graveyard, a defiant Halloween display meant to embarrass, provoke, and reclaim a strip of land I was told didn't belong to me. But somehow, that moment of pettiness bloomed into something real. Now, on weekend mornings, I sit with a coffee cup on the porch and watch Milo, my lazy old lab, snoring in a bed of lavender and yarrow. The sun hits the flower beds just right. Neighbors wave. Wind chimes tinkle softly down the street. It's peaceful. It's mine. And yet, it belongs to all of us. Because this isn't a story about plants or fines or foam tombstones. It's about pushing back gently but firmly when rules lose sight of people. About knowing when to resist and how to turn that resistance into growth. It's about finding beauty where no one expects it. About claiming space not with anger, but with roots. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's simple. If they try to dig up your garden, plant a forest instead.